This is a video for tutorial for Module 2 of Phil 123 on the topic of Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. I want to provide some background to Hume's dialogues because it's incredibly impressive work, but it can be really intimidating on the first read if you're not completely clear about some of the things that are going on. The first thing to say about it's helpful to think of the title of Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. We call it a dialogue because, again, it's in dialogue form. There's three main protagonists who are speaking in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. And I want to talk about each one of them a little bit because that's going to help sort of understand what's going on and what's happening. The first philosopher, the first person in the dialogue we want to talk about is the philosopher Philo. He's called Philo. Philo is Greek for knowledge, or something like Philo is Greek for knowledge. My Greek's very bad. You have to forgive me. Philo is really one of the better philosophers in the dialogue. Philo is very much a skeptic. Okay, Philo is going to be very critical of the teleological argument, really all of the proof arguments. Whether or not Philo is an atheist is a bit of a disputed matter in the literature. You can find some commentators who insist that Philo is not merely a skeptic, okay, but that he simply believes that God does not exist. That's not my reading of the dialogues, but the entire text of the dialogues isn't reproduced, so it's hard to make that claim right now. In any event, Philo is a very good philosopher, and he's also going to play the role of the skeptic. As we'll see, he'll give us a very critical discussion of the argument by analogy, of the teleological argument in particular. He doesn't find it very convincing. By contrast, Cleanthes, another very capable philosopher, is clearly a theist. He clearly believes that God exists. And importantly, Cleanthes is not only a theist, he's also a proponent of what we'll call natural religion. Now, what is natural religion? You'll find some definitions on the handout, but the proponent of natural religion holds that we can have religious knowledge about God's existence and God's nature, in exactly the same way that we can have knowledge about the natural world, by observation, through experience, based on a posteriori reasoning. That's natural religion. Natural religion is to be contrasted with revealed religion. Someone who goes in for revealed religion holds that we can't know about God, whether he exists and what he's like, in the same way that we know truths about the natural world. Okay? We might know them by an act of divine grace. We might know them as a matter of revelation, but we cannot have religious knowledge in the way that we have, say, scientific knowledge. Cleanthes, again, is a proponent of, Cleanthes is sympathetic with natural religion. Philo is going to be a critic of natural religion. He's going to doubt that we can know nearly as much as Cleanthes thinks we can know. But he's not hostile to natural religion either. The third philosopher in Hume's dialogues, Demea, is not just critical of natural religion, he thinks it doesn't work at all. Unlike Cleanthes, and really unlike Philo as well, Demea thinks that we can't have religious knowledge based on observation. Ain't gonna happen. Okay? Now, something to say, not just about these three characters, but also what they purport to show. And this is as good a place as any to talk about what I want to call the divine attributes. Okay? This is relevant to understanding not just whether or not God exists, but what God is like if he exists, what we might call God's nature. Demea, and you can see this at a couple different points in Hume's dialogues, and this is actually included in a quote that's on the handout, Demea distinguishes between knowledge about the being of God, whether or not God exists, and the nature of God, what God is like should he exist. Demea is going to suggest, at one point he seems sympathetic with versions of the ontological and the ontological argument, which we'll talk about in Module 3, but he's very critical of any argument based on experience. Not so, again, with Cleanthes. But in any case, what are we talking about when we're talking about God? As we'll see, Cleanthes is going to purport to show that we can know, based on a version of the teleological argument, that God exists. But what is God like if he exists? The divine attributes are three familiar properties that typically, not always, but typically are ascribed to God. They are omniscience, omnipotence, and what I will call omnibenevolence. What is omniscience? Well, an individual who's omniscient is supremely wise, supremely intelligent. An omniscient individual knows everything that it's possible to know. Okay? That might be different from knowing everything. Even an omniscient God might not know what you're going to have for dinner tomorrow if you haven't made up your mind or indeed even thought about having dinner. If there's no fact of the matter, say because human beings have free will, we'll talk about that in a later module as well, then maybe not even an omniscient being could know truths like that. There's no fact of the matter. But an omniscient being would have to know everything it's possible to know. Similarly, an omnipotent being would have to be able to do everything that's possible to do. An omnipotent being is supremely powerful. Now here too, being supremely powerful might not mean being able to do just anything. Can God create a rock that's too heavy for himself to lift? Think about that. There might be a logical contradiction hiding in there. But in any case, even if it's not possible for an omnipotent being to do that, say the logically impossible, that's no restriction on an omnipotent being's power. An omnipotent being is simply capable of doing everything it's possible to do. So an omniscient being is supremely intelligent. An omnipotent being is supremely powerful. And what I will call an omnibenevolent being is supremely loving and caring, as loving and caring as it's possible for any being to be. So, traditionally, or at least typically, God is understood to have these three divine attributes: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. Typically, traditionally, we might say, God is understood to be O, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Now, what I think is going to be interesting is to see whether or not the teleological argument really does yield the conclusion that God, identified as an intelligent designer, is in fact whether or not the teleological argument rescues all of the divine attributes. Again, on that second handout, you will find a very extended quote from Cleanthes. This is a classic presentation of the teleological argument, Cleanthes' particular argument from design. It's a particular example of the argument by analogy, the third kind of teleological argument that shows up earlier on the handout. Now, Philo is going to be very critical of this argument. Cleanthes gives us the classic presentation of the argument from design. Philo gives us the classic refutation of it. As you're thinking about Cleanthes' arguments, think about two things. First of all, just how similar is the universe, for example, with the product of human contrivance, things like watches, things like cars, things like computers. But also, and this is the second thing, think about how different they are. That's going to play into Philo's response and his critique of the teleological argument.